Hey guys, Joe Marler from Daniel Defense. Hope you're doing well today. In today's video, we're going to show you how to upgrade your trigger in your DDM4. Triggers are probably one of the first things you want to upgrade if you buy a rifle that has a mil-spec trigger in it, like most of the DDM4s do. Fire control groups are going to consist of your hammer, trigger, disconnector, the springs for those three components, and the two pins that hold them in place. So in today's video, we're going to show you how to install a Geissele SSA trigger, and the only tools you're going to need is a gunsmithing hammer and a 5/32 punch. So let's show you how to do this. All right, so I've already separated my upper, I've ensured my firearm is safe, and I've secured my lower receiver into a lower receiver vise block in my vise. Next thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna make sure my firearm is set to semi. I'm gonna hold the hammer down, squeeze the trigger, and just ride it forward. Okay, I'm just taking a little bit of pressure off of that spring. Next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my 5/32 punch, I'm gonna drift out our hammer pin. The hammer pin's the one that sits up a little bit higher than the trigger pin, and it's the one closest to the magazine well. Sometimes you'll need a hammer to knock this out. A lot of times you can just use force and push it through. Once I've got my hammer pin out, I'm gonna hold on to the hammer while I'm pulling my punch out. It is still under a lot of spring pressure. Hammer and hammer spring will come out. Once that's out, I don't have anything holding my trigger pin in. So all I need to do, push my trigger pin out. You can push this out in either direction as well, right to left, left to right. Push that out. I'm gonna hold down on my disconnector so it doesn't jump away from me. Pull out my punch. And then I can remove the trigger assembly. I've got my disconnector, trigger spring, disconnector springs under there as well. So that'll all come out as one unit. All right, so now that we have our standard fire control group out of our lower receiver, it's time to install the Geissele SSA. While I've got it out, this gun's been shot a little bit. I'm just gonna take a Q-tip, just get out all the carbon buildups on the inside, just real quick, mop out with Q-tip. And so now we're going to get ready to install the trigger assembly of our SSA fire control group. You'll see a little silver pin here right in the middle. What that's doing is it's keeping our trigger assembly lined up with our disconnector, this guy right here. And it's basically just gonna drift out when we start installing the pin. I'm gonna check to make sure our hammer spring is installed correctly, which it is, and I'm going to insert it into my lower. When you're doing this, you wanna make sure that your safety selector is set to fire or semi. That way you've got clearance for the back of the trigger bar. Once we have it in position, you can push down on that trigger from the top, or if you'd like, you can come down and grab trigger bow from underneath. And we need to get the holes lined up with the hole in our lower. So most trigger pins are gonna have two grooves on them. You'll have one on one end, and you'll have one in the center. And when you're installing the pin for the trigger, it does not matter which end goes in first. And it doesn't matter whether you go through the left side or the right side of the lower. Getting the holes lined up. I'm gonna use my gunsmithing hammer. I'm just gonna use some light taps, start tapping it through. As I do that, slave pin will start coming out the other side. Slave pin's out. I'm almost there. I just need to get the pin to come through the other side of the lower. So I'm gonna come down here, make sure everything's lined up. You should be able to use your finger to pass it through. And that pin should be flush on both sides. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna install our hammer assembly. Really important that your hammer spring is installed correctly. When you install this, this spring is gonna coil underneath and it's gonna face back towards the buffer tube. And both of these legs are going to sit directly on top of your trigger pin. And that is what's gonna keep that trigger pin from walking out. One of those outer grooves is going to marry up with one of these spring legs, and it's going to keep that from walking out. So I'm going to get it in position, making sure both legs are on top of the trigger pin. I'm going to grab my hammer pin. Again, same pin as the trigger pin, outer groove, center groove. Now on this, save yourself a little bit of grief and install it with the smoothed end in first, because as soon as it gets to the center, it's going to snap in. If you put the grooved end in first, the J pin that runs up through the center of the hammer, through the hammer pin hole, it's gonna snap in there, and then you gotta fight with it to get past it. So you can do the smooth end in first, save yourself a little bit of trouble. So I'm gonna wrap my finger around the hammer. I have my thumb on the back, and I'm gonna push forward and down so that I can line up the hole. smooth that in first. I'm going to use the nylon side of my gunsmithing hammer. I'm going to tap it lightly. Okay, it's almost through. I'll come over here where I can line it up, tap it in, and just like your trigger pin, your hammer pin should be flush on both sides of your lower receiver. So looking down inside the fire control group, I can see that my hammer spring is coiled underneath. Both legs are pointing straight back at me towards my buffer tube, and they're sitting directly on top of my trigger pin, and they are outboard of the coils of the trigger spring. So I can actually do a manual function test on this to make sure everything's working properly. Go ahead and manually cock the hammer. I'm going to squeeze the trigger, making sure I don't let it come up and hit my bolt catch. Just ride it up. Hold the trigger down as I cock the hammer again, release. Trigger seems to be resetting properly. And when the hammer is cocked, you should be able to manipulate the safety selector to safe. And from there, you're ready to put your upper receiver group back on and go do a live function fire at the range. All right, guys, as you can see, pretty easy to install a fire control group. Couple things I want to mention. First, always wear your PPE, personal protective equipment, okay? Always put your safety glasses on. You've got a lot of spring tension inside of your fire control group. You don't want that stuff getting away from you, coming up, hitting you in the face, poking you in the eye. So PPE, make sure you wear it. Number two, if you aren't comfortable doing this type of work on your own, seek a competent gunsmith. There's lots of really good gunsmiths out there that know how to do this. They'll do it for you very affordably, and they can get you that trigger that you want. So if you'd like to learn more about Daniel Defense, subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. Check us out on the website, danieldefense.com. Give us a call. We've got a whole bunch of folks here eager to answer your calls, answer your questions, and we look forward to seeing you on the range.